Welcome to the WildChina On-Air conversation series. My name is Zhang Mei. I'm your hostess for this conversation. I'm also the founder of WildChina. We curate travel to China for individuals, companies, and schools, but obviously we can't travel right now. So we thought we'd bring China to you. And now, today we have a wonderful guest speaker, Philip Tinari. And Philip is the director and CEO of UCCA Center for Contemporary Art. For anyone who's been to Beijing, you know this is on the must-visit list for anyone or interested in art or not, actually, modern art. Now, I've known Philip's work at UCCA for many, many years, but only recently met, right, Philip? I went to, I think it was the reopening party after UCCA went through an extensive renovation. There was this show for the artist Qiu Zhijie, and he was he drew all these maps to showcase, to somehow make sense of the chaos that China was going through, the growing pain of economy and art or history or anything, you name it. And at the entrance, there was this enormous painting, a map called Art and China After 1989. And on that map, there were all these art academies, successful artists, art dealers, Art Basel, etc. And somewhere there was a place with a label called 美术馆的杨馆长, Foreign Art Museum Director in China. And that was Philip. So I'm going to show you that memory. It was great, actually. Here. How do I get to this one? Are you seeing this? Are you seeing my screen properly? Can you see this map?
Yes, but
okay.
Maybe go to full screen.
Should I make it full screen? I don't know. Here, 美术馆的杨馆长. You didn't know I had that picture, did you?
No.
I never sent it to you. I was holding out for a situation like this. In any event, I thought actually Mr. Qiu was very accurate in sort of sensing the changes China was going through. And he was even the very precisely placed Philip on this map, sort of at the forefront of China's art development, the art scene. So anyway, it's nice to have you. I'm going to go through a little bit of quick bio recap. I think undergrad at Duke, master's at Harvard, PhD in art history at Oxford, which you're still working on right now, right? Fulbright scholar, a lot of incredible labels, and of course he's completely fluent in Chinese, so we could do this session in Chinese as well. But what's most important is Philip has been in Beijing since 2001, and anyone who's been to 798 at that time would have the memory of this sort of gray and dusty precision tool plant. No one could imagine the hustle and bustle and the glamour of 798 today. And I think UCCA now welcomes 1 million visitors a year, an incredible number. Right? And also last year, I made a specific trip to visit your Dune gallery at Beidaihe. It's such a surprising place, literally buried sort of under the sand dunes and inside a beachfront real estate development. So it's the perfect place to feel where China is today in terms of art, in terms of development. And all these years, Philip had not only a front row seat, you were also directing the show, literally. So today, I think the best way to do this is probably we change the format a little bit, and Philip will give us a quick, half an hour recap, a very condensed version of the history of China's modern art. And then we go into the Q&A session. Okay, shall we? Let me hand this over to you, Philip.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, May, for the invitation. Yeah, I mean, you're obviously someone who I've known about and heard of throughout these years in China, and it was great to finally meet not that long ago. And thank you for taking that picture. So yes, and hi to I was just looking through the participants list, and I see some old friends like actually Christopher Ho, who's participating in the show that's currently up at UCCA right now, an artist, Matt Turner, and some others. So hi guys. Anyway, let's. I thought it would be interesting to try and give a sort of radically condensed overview of the last 40 years of contemporary art in China in 30 minutes, and then to go into a kind of conversation mode. But I mean, my point obviously is not to, explain everything that happened in the art scene in this incredibly long and vibrant period, but really just to give a little bit of context for the kind of work that I've been doing at UCCA these last 9 years, and just for the overall kind of ecology and situation of contemporary art in China today, which hopefully everyone who's not in China right now will have a chance to encounter in person again soon. And really, it's a controversial, but in a way, kind of the only starting point is the Stars exhibition in September of 1979, when a group of artists who kind of come together, very much involved with a poetry magazine called Jintian, and with a democracy movement at the moment of kind of Deng Xiaoping's ascendancy and the 30th anniversary of the PRC, came together to make this exhibition of paintings, not very formally sophisticated, but extremely optimistic and vibrant, which they hung on the fence around the National Art, what's now called the National Art Museum of China, was then just called the National Gallery. And I think this exhibition in so many ways sets the stage, including for the reason that it was shut down after 2 days by the local authorities, but actually it was endorsed by the higher cultural ministry authorities. So already you have this kind of incredible complexity of, how big is this space for expression and display and discourse around contemporary art in China. And I always just love this image by Li Xiaoping, because you see visualized so literally this kind of split between the official of the museum and the unofficial of who's outside. And it's a line that will be blurred again and again throughout this period. And so I just find it interesting that it's exactly 40 years between that exhibition and then this exhibition, which is a show we mounted last summer called Picasso, Birth of a Genius, which was our first true blockbuster. This was the first weekend of its run, which was in June of 2019. Unimaginable by our today's standards of the socially distanced world. But I mean, I just think it's interesting to think about how a public for modern and contemporary art emerges through this period of social and economic development. One important moment along that path comes basically 10 years into the story in 1989. This is February 4th, 1989, the exhibition in English called China Avant-Garde, 中国现代艺术大展, and a lot of times just known by its logo, which is this no U-turn traffic sign. This was actually, so there was a very avid art movement throughout the 1980s as new texts became available, as people started to encounter things from beyond China, things from greater China, and really work, and as the academies and the magazines and kind of other parts of the state provided an open space for experimentation. This show in 89 was kind of a belated summary. It should have happened in 87, but there was the the anti-spiritual pollution campaign going on. I always forget which one comes first. Anyway, it was postponed. It happened in 1989, and famously, the artist Xiao Lu fired a gun into her own work, strangely foreshadowing the events of later in 1989. This is a work by Huang Yongping from around that time, called a brief history of Chinese painting and a history of modern painting washed in a washing machine for 2 minutes. First done in 1986-87. Here it is on view at the Guggenheim in an exhibition that I worked on in 2017. But I think this idea of trying to fuse different value systems and the kind of resulting absurdity is another that sort of runs through the story. And Huang Yongping, this singular figure, who sadly just passed away last year in November, is someone who will resurface throughout this story. So just a few weeks actually after the 89 show that I just mentioned, in May of 1989 in Paris, you had a really important exhibition called Magiciens de la Terre, Magicians of the Earth, which understood itself and publicized itself as the first global contemporary art exhibition. It was 100 artists, 50 were Euro-American, and 50 were, I think what in Chinese you would best call Ya Fei La, sort of from Africa, Asia, Latin America, Australasia. And this is probably the most famous image of that exhibition. Actually, it's not Chinese artists. On the wall, you have the English artist Richard Long, and on the ground, you have a painting by the Yuan Dumu, or Aboriginal community from Australia. And these kinds of juxtapositions were seen as quite innovative, and later as quite problematic. And it's been an exhibition that's really been debated in this field for many years now. The reason I mention it is because the same Huang Yongping that I just mentioned, with that one pile of pulp, actually came to Paris and made this installation where he washed copies of the People's Daily and of the French left-wing newspaper Libération in washing machines, and made these kinds of serpentine forms. So this was his contribution to this exhibition. Along with Gu Dexin and Yang Jiechang, 3 Chinese artists included in this show. And I think what's worth noting is that, where maybe from some other contexts, artists were selected who were maybe more like craftspeople, or maybe weren't necessarily, on the same page, kind of discursively, conceptually, with these modern artists from the West that they were put into dialogue with. Actually, these Chinese artists were very much up to the task, and I think were very cognizant of the complexities and the compromises and the misunderstandings involved in already showing their work outside of China. And I point to this exhibition because it is really the ground zero for thinking about kind of Chinese art shown internationally. And it's a trend that, of course, accelerates after 1989 as some artists leave and kind of resettle in the West. This is a very early piece by Cai Guoqiang in the summer of 1990. In an exhibition curated by Fei Dawei, who would go on to become the first director of UCCA, in a small village in Provence. And it's really one of the first, what he would later call explosion events. And it's probably a kind of practice you're all familiar with. He famously went on to direct the fireworks for the opening of the Beijing Olympics. But humble beginnings here in a field somewhere not far from the Mont Sainte-Victoire, which appears in so many of Cézanne's paintings. Or something like this. This is Yan Peiming, another very important Chinese painter, sort of site-specifically painting on a barn door in this village. So there's this kind of avant-garde moment of kind of tactics of this gritty Chinese scene sort of transposed into Europe that doesn't last very long, because what happens by 1993 is you start to get these much more programmatic exhibitions, like this one curated by Johnson Chang and Li Xianting, or this one curated by important Dutch curator Hans van Dyck, who lived in China more or less until his death in 2002. And these are really the exhibitions that establish a canon. So that we talk about political pop and cynical realism. These movements, if you watched the Sotheby's auction last night, online, you would have seen a number of artists who kind of came to the fore through exhibitions like these, which were really trying to present a vision of often a very politically articulated contemporary Chinese art to an international audience in the political context of the deepening of reform that happens, in the mid 90s around Deng's trip south and all of that. I always love this one too. This was Fang Lijun on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in December of 1993. So extremely early on, and the headline just gets me every time. Not just a yawn, but the howl that could free China. So this, kind of artists were conscripted into these discourses of political dissidence and of liberal democracy in ways that maybe they believed in or maybe didn't. And this is a very complicated question. They were also very suspicious at times of this narrative. And so this is a painting by Zhou Tiehai, a Shanghai artist that we featured in the Guggenheim show. And the guy in the center is actually Andrew Solomon, who's a writer maybe some people know or are familiar with. He's a really amazing writer. He's actually much better known now for his writings on depression and on gay domesticity and kind of other topics. But in the late 80s and early 90s, shortly after he graduated from Yale, He went to the Soviet Union and just reread this book the other day. It's this beautiful book called The Irony Tower about the art scene as the Soviet Union is falling apart. And then actually, and he wrote the piece that I just showed you the cover of in the New York Times Magazine in 1993. And so this artist, Zhou Tiehai, actually made this really sarcastic painting, kind of depicting him as this savior, this kind of Marco Polo figure coming from afar to discover and shine light upon the Chinese artists and bring their work back. And so there was, my point by showing this is just to say there was always a kind of suspicion about this kind of cultural back and forth that was happening. Which really comes to a head in a few years later in 1997. This is the artist Yan Lei, along with the artist Hong Hao. And if you see at the bottom right corner, this is a letter. It's an invitation to Documento, which is the most important contemporary art exhibition in the world. Even still, it happens every 5 years in a tiny city called Kassel in Westphalia in Germany. To be invited to the show is kind of one of the greatest honors a contemporary artist can receive. And so Yan Lei and Hong Hao, they actually, if you look at the letters signed by someone called Ielne Owagano, it's actually just Yan Lei Hong Hao written backwards in Pinyin. So it's a fake invitation, and they sent this to 100 artists in and around Beijing and Shanghai, and apparently a few of them even bought plane tickets and were preparing to go and participate in this exhibition that did not exist. So I mentioned all this just because this whole history of showing contemporary Chinese art abroad is fraught and is full of misunderstandings and of complexities and of power differentials and all kinds of complicated things. On a whole, I think it's still quite important to present work outside of China. So this is kind of, for me, I've worked on quite a number of projects to bring work by contemporary Chinese artists into Western institutions, and this was sort of the apotheosis of that, for me at least, was this exhibition in 2017 at the Guggenheim called Art in China After 1989, Theater of the World. And you can see kind of on the ramps of Frank Lloyd Wright's, amazing rotunda, all these different tendencies and moments in this long and complicated story. And the central piece is Chen Zhen's, it's called Precipitous Parturition, and it's a sort of dragon-like figure of bicycle inner tubes, but you look at that belly and it's giving birth to all these sort of matchbox cars. So this kind of symbolic narration is another tendency we often see. Anyway, so that's one arc of the story. I'd like to talk now about a different arc, which is kind of international art in China, or the internationalization of China's own art scene. And this is a story that I think we can really date to 2000 and to the Shanghai Biennale. It's actually the third edition, but it's the first with any kind of international profile. And it was curated by Ho Han Ru and Toshio Shimizu, and in the old Shanghai Art Museum, which was actually the racing club built on the People's Square, which is, of course, was the jockey club of sort of semi-colonial Shanghai. And for that kind of monumental but also contradictory sort of moment, again, the artist Huang Yongping, back to him, created this piece called Sandbank, Bank of Sand. I think he was playing on the title of the exhibition, which was called Haishang, Shanghai. So this is called, this is actually a model of the HSBC building on the Bund in the form of a sandcastle. And of course, Bund becomes sort of the Sanskrit root for sandy embankment. So it's Sandbank, Bank of Sand, and it's sort of left to disintegrate over the course of the exhibition. Wow. So it was I think a kind of beautifully melancholy and a statement of a kind of resistance, even in this context on the one hand of state authority, as represented by the Shanghai Art Museum, but also of this kind of colonial past. I mean, if you look at the room that this is a sort of ballroom of a colonial club where this is happening, and I think Huang Yongping never lost sight of that in his career. The main parallel show during this exhibition, Shanghai Biennale 2000, was curated by someone you may have heard of called Ai Weiwei. And it was, titled, as you see here, and it happened in a warehouse actually around the corner from the area that's since become the M50 gallery district, which for many years was kind of Shanghai's answer to 798. Shanghai's art scene has developed massively just in the last 5 years. So M50 is still around, but it's no longer the center of action. But I think just it's interesting to juxtapose these two forms of resistance and to think about how they compare and how they're different. This is not an artwork, obviously, but this is the context of the story that I'm telling you. Is this kind of pre-Olympic Beijing of the early 2000s when China is really looking for its place on the world stage and when things are changing kind of by the week. And in that context, you have the emergence of a Chinese market and a Chinese context for contemporary art. So this is a gentleman called Guan Yi, who his significance in this story is that he was really the first person to perform the role of Chinese collector on the global stage. So in the 90s, in the moment I was just showing you images from, one of the big problems was that kind of in the aftermath of Tiananmen, the state system was no longer so open to experimentation, and it meant that artists who maybe would have had day jobs in the academies or in newspapers or magazines were kind of driven more or less underground, and they didn't have many places or opportunities to exhibit inside of China. So Hong Kong became quite important, Taiwan became important, and these exhibitions abroad became important, as did foreign collectors like Guy Ullens, who set up the UCCA, like Uli Sig, who later gave his collection to M+ in Hong Kong. But what you didn't really have as part of that story was Chinese collectors. And this is a picture from 2005, which is about the moment when you start to get a critical mass of collectors in China interested in contemporary art. And that's a trend that accelerates pretty massively after 2008 and the financial crisis. And that in the 2010s evolves further as these collectors become interested not just in Chinese contemporary art, but in contemporary art from all over the world, driven along by things like Art Basel Hong Kong. And this is the context for sort of 798 and specifically for UCCA, which you see here from above before its opening and renovation, which happened in 2007. So that smokestack is sort of our smokestack. And you can actually make out in the center of these kind of sawtooth roofs, you see two identical buildings actually. So that's really where UCCA is, and now that sort of boring building at the front of the site on the left of your screen. That's where our offices now are. So it's kind of 1, 2, 3. This rectangle, the smokestack building, and then all of our main shows. And I'm going to be showing you some images of shows that happened there. Happened in the Great Hall, which is sort of that with the sort of ceiling to the right there. And this is what it looked like before it was renovated. And then this is what it looked like in 2007 when when we first opened, which was November of 2007. I didn't join until 2011. So this original period I sort of experienced from the outside more as a journalist and an art critic. And this is an image from our opening exhibition called 85 New Wave, which was really an attempt to historicize the group of artists I sort of started by talking about, the artists who became active in the 1980s. And this is a piece that's probably familiar to many of you by Xu Bing called Book from the Sky, where he has invented through something like 3,000 Chinese characters by combining radicals and phonetic elements and on ways that don't actually exist and printing them on books and scrolls and arraying them like this, which is a piece he first showed in 1988 to great consternation. And which in a moment I'll show you, we actually showed a second time in 2018, so 11 years later, when we did his retrospective and right before we embarked on the big renovation that May talked about at the beginning. This is a piece by Geng Jianyi, or in the corner by Zhang Pei Li, other key artists of this 85 New Wave movement. And this is our opening exhibition. So just a little bit to understand sort of the starting point of UCCA. Fei Dawei, who was a very important curator and critic who began working in the 80s and was one of the curatorial collective behind the the 1989 exhibition, was the first person, really built a collection with Mr. Ollens, and then was the first person to run UCCA for a few months after it opened, and then a French guy called Jerome Sans arrived. So I just wanted to kind of break our history down into 3 phases. So that was sort of the first one, the opening one. This is radically abridged, but this is the second one. This is actually no longer our entrance. This was our entrance between 2012 and 2017, 18, which is the period where I was, I joined in late 2011, always as director, but for the first 5 years I reported to a different CEO, so I was not as involved in the sort of business side of the business. I was more, working like a chief curator. This was the first show I did with an artist called Gu Dexin, who was one of the 3 Chinese artists in the Magicien de la Terre show that I just mentioned, known for these installations of fruit, which is just simply left to decay. A rookie mistake, I didn't realize you needed to put down plastic underneath apples if you put them on a concrete floor. So if you come to our space, you'll actually notice when you get to this corner, this left corner where you see this field of apples, you can actually notice little circles on the ground, which were left by the acid in the apples as they decompose. Literally my first show, and they didn't fire me, so that was good. And I assume we're going to have to redo the floors. I mean, it's been almost 15 years now, and they're sort of showing their age. But every time I go down there, I like this idea that space has memory. Yeah. And then we did a whole series of shows that have tried to highlight young artists and sort of younger creativity. So this is an exhibition we made in 2013 called On-Off, China's Young Artists in Concept and Practice, which is really a kind of generational show. I think the mark of a show like this is if people forget which artists were in and which artists were out, and it kind of becomes actually the sort of a moniker for the generation. So this is very much like the sort of Ba Ling Ho, the post-1980s artists. And this title of On-Off comes from the interface on Astral, which is a VPN that a lot of us use. It's just a giant switch. And for the curators, it was a way of talking about this group of 50 artists as sort of stuck uncomfortably between and productively between different realities, different sets of expectations, different systems, different ways of thinking and making work. And we've done a number of, shows that try to put Chinese artists of different generations into an international conversation. So this is an artist with an exhibition with Xu Zhen, an artist who also works under the name of Maiden, that we did in 2014, and this sort of series of the victory of Samothrace on top of a Buddhist sculpture in this kind of witty juxtaposition. We also, from time to time, try to introduce key international figures. So this is William Kentridge, a really important South African-born artist of Jewish descent originally, he's kind of spent his entire career kind of working through the visual, historical, and intellectual legacy of apartheid, and a lot of meditation on colonialism, on societies in transition. This is a piece that he made in 2012 for Documenta called The Refusal of Time, which is it's like a deconstructed classroom with this sort of series of performative vignettes about the absurdity of time zones, and kind of going back to Paris and Greenwich in the early, very late 19th, early 20th century as time zones were being codified around the world. So this was shown at UCCA in 2015. And then, for example, Robert Rauschenberg, 1925 to 2008, very important American artist who actually famously showed in China in 1985 in an exhibition that really opened the door for many Chinese artists to think about contemporary art in new ways. So in 2016, to show this important piece of his late career called The Quarter Mile Painting, it literally is 300 meters long, a single work, was quite important for us. And then, this is it's actually a painting that takes on a new resonance, but it's by Zheng Fanzhi, an artist who's quite well known in the marketplace, but is, I think, also just an incredible painter. And this is a triptych that he made in his hometown of Wuhan, observing the Xiehe Hospital during his student days. But I also I always like this image because it's, it also speaks to this educational mission and philanthropic mission that we've taken on in terms of, as much as UCCA has come to rely a lot on, say, ticket sales and donations and membership and that kind of thing, we're also always trying to open the door to art for new populations and communities that might not otherwise encounter it. So these are kids from a migrant school that we often will bring in groups like this, completely subsidized, to enjoy a workshop and sort of learn about the exhibition. This is sort of how it all happens. This is our annual gala, which again will not happen in quite this form this year, but it's really been a process of trying to build a community around an institution that can support something like this. So to get away from the old model of a single funder, single founder kind of situation, and more towards something where it's a whole city and a whole kind of scene that is behind the thing, has been quite important for us. This is, coming back to just 2018 when we were preparing to embark on the renovation. It was really fitting. This is actually in exactly the same space that this piece was shown in 2007, differently configured with a drop ceiling and black walls and different lighting, but we subsequently opened the space up. So this is actually exactly where, in one of the first images in this deck, you saw the people waiting in line to go into the Picasso show. So I love the way that, a single room can just serve so many different purposes. Yeah, this is what UCCA looks like now. So we finally have, a street presence, and this building at the kind of really mundane building at the entrance has become kind of a facade for the whole thing. And this renovation was designed by OMA, which is the same firm that did the CCTV tower and the CBD. It's actually just only their second built project in China, and it just has been. The point is that it's opened our space up to people physically. I mean, it's one problem is people used to sort of be standing in front of UCCA and not quite even realize where they were because it was sort of buried in this dark alley. And now with sort of transparency and glass and even just this floor covering, which kind of is this algorithmic gradient that starts sort of white by the street and kind of gets successively darker gray as you come under the original threshold and actually cross this office building and enter into the galleries. We do some crazy projects from time to time. So this is a one-day exhibition with the artist Zhao Yao, who's one of the artists from this on-off generation I mentioned. He makes these kind of things that look like abstract paintings, but they're actually just brain teasers from the kinds of books that you might give to your kid to, sort of puzzles. So I think this one is about how do you draw a white line that goes from yellow to red to green to blue, and get from A to B across this field. So it looks like abstract painting, but it's actually something much different. Anyway, he started making these as paintings. Then he made this giant tapestry of the same kind of design, which he actually then left on the side of a mountain in a Tibetan region of Gansu for a year and sort of photographed it every day. So working with the local monks, kind of putting it out there, sort of letting it take on sacred properties, and then bringing it back to Beijing and sort of displaying it on the soccer pitch at the workers' stadium for just a day. So we use this in presentations with the government just to show that we're able to get approvals for kind of crazy things from time to time. This was really a wonderful moment in 2018 to bring everyone onto the field at the workers' stadium for a day. I may mention this, UCCA Dune, which is our second location. It's in this kind of planned vacation community called Aranya, which is it's sort of south of central Beidaihe. So it's 300 kilometers outside of Beijing. This was the opening of the building. We've now done 4 or 5 shows there, and it's and the building itself, which is designed by the architect Li Hu, which is one of the great Chinese architects of his generation, has gone on to win all kinds of prizes and things. But I think more interestingly, it's just I love the idea of first of all, working in a completely counterintuitive space. I mean, there's not a single flat wall in this entire building. Okay, there's one, But it's really about how do you make exhibitions that are tailored to a non-traditional space, and it becomes quite inspiring for artists. It's also become a bit of a curatorial lab. So our young curators, will sort of take turns organizing the shows, and kind of each time it's generally a group show. So, anywhere from 3 to 9 or 10 artists who will come and react to this place and spend some time there. And the combination of just kind of architecture and natural environment and this kind of surreal setting of this vacation community are quite something. So it's become a little bit of a destination. And if you ever come to China again, please, you have an extra day. It's a quick train ride. It's 2 hours from Beijing to Beidaihe, and it's really not just for UCCA doing, but there's a number of other interesting pieces of architecture and kind of things to do in this area, and it's definitely worth a trip. So that then we've moved on to doing these kinds of, this is our Picasso show last summer. I mean, I think it sort of speaks to the level of production and kind of audience, since that's we're able to attract. This is empty, obviously, but this sort of central courtyard at the end of the show was packed with people kind of for the whole summer. And these kinds of exhibitions for an audience in China right now, I think, are really important and really powerful, because they're what's able to bring new audiences into the art world. And I think, I'm always very cautious to, you have a show like this, and maybe at the same time you have a smaller show of kind of more avant-garde Chinese art, and try to expose new populations and new communities to contemporary art. If you come to UCCA like this week, you would see this exhibition, which is called Meditations in an Emergency. That's named after the Frank O'Hara anthology from the 60s. He was actually curator at MoMA when he was during his short life. It's a 26 artist group show, kind of Chinese and international, of works that we kind of are able to interpret as responding to the pandemic in one way or the other. So none of them are made, I think maybe one or two is made in 2020. Most of them are works from the last few years that have taken on a new significance in light of recent events. And we were able to put together an exhibition. There's 5 sections. So the first talks about the everyday and the disappearance of our routines. And one talks about the body and mortality and fragility. And another talks about humans and animals. And one talks about migration and anti-globalization. And the final section thinks about misinformation and rumor mongering and fake news and those kinds of things. So it's a kind of high wire feed. It was actually quite hard to get through all of the scrutiny that a show like this attracts from various corners. But I think it's been quite cathartic for the city, as well as people have come to sort of encounter this experience of art. And it's also, I think, most importantly, spoken to the nimbleness of an institution in China right now. So, I mean, working on that exhibition at the Guggenheim, the months and years that go into very precise decisions about how to present certain works of art, and how to curate a show. When that kind of understanding of art and passion for art meets kind of China speed, it's interesting what can be done. So this show was put together in just 6 weeks. Basically, we learned in mid-March that we could reopen in mid-May, and sort of went from there. And then, at the end of this year, we'll be opening our 3rd venue. I mean, our 2nd kind of urban venue. Ignore the Starbucks logo on the ground floor. This is basically floors 2, 3, and 4 of this building. So there's nothing on the ground floor, as you can see. Will be UCCA, or it's going to be called UCCA Edge. The building is called Edge, and this is at the intersection of Chufulu and Xizanglu in Jing'an District, Shanghai, just north of the Suzhou Creek. For the serious Shanghai people, it used to be Jiabe, and then was folded into Jing'an. So I'm not trying to claim to be from a better district than we're actually in. But no, we're really excited to be arriving in Shanghai, and to be actually in quite a vibrant urban downtown location. So it's not on the West Bund, it's not out in Hongqiao or something, but it's kind of right in the city. And this space, of course, will not have the ceiling heights of Beijing, but we'll have an outdoor sculpture terrace. We're going to have a wonderful restaurant, bar, cafe situation. And I think it'll just be a much more kind of like lifestyle experience in kind of Shanghai fashion. But of course, also the core of the thing is the exhibitions of Chinese and international artists at in the kinds of ways we've been talking about. So actually, that's the end of my images. So I think that might be a good place to leave it and start conversation. Thanks.
Perfect. When is this opening, the Shanghai venue?
So we're on record saying early 2021, but we've internally been trying to beat that sort of since the beginning. So hopefully before the end of this year, we actually, so the building is built. Our construction project is transforming the levels 2, 3, and 4 into the museum. So that's actually just starting at the end of this month, and we anticipate 3 months of construction for that.
So. Speed.
Yeah, it's
fantastic. And thank you so much, Philip. This was an amazing sort of quick, very condensed. If anyone's having difficulty like I am trying to remember the artists' names and different eras we're going through, 3 ways to make up for it. One is this show is recorded and it will be available on YouTube, so you can come back and slow it down and appreciate the art. 2 is go visit UCCA. Not right now. It'll take a little bit time. Maybe, this current show of China's sort of digestion of this whole pandemic experience is so relevant. Maybe we could do something like a virtual tour with the curator to hear what they are thinking. I think that would be great. That would be amazing. Absolutely. I would love to see. And thirdly, we can wait for to read the PhD paper from Philip when you're done.
Yes, that's my pandemic project. Yes, finally. Sort of.
That's great. So while you were talking, there were some comments here. I have lots of questions, and all our audience, you're welcome to put in any question in the dialogue. We'll try to get to them. I think I do want to recognize Tom Gold reminded me that you're also a member of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. So wonderful. Thank you, Tom. And there are 2 already very sort of in-depth questions. And the first one is from Matt Turner. What is the critical discourse around contemporary art like in China?
Yeah, I mean, obviously big question, but I think, so if we look at it in kind of different periods, in the 80s, there was kind of a topic of the year, right? The community would spend a few months or a year debating, the role of abstract painting or the relevance of certain kind of philosophical trends or art making tactics. I think a lot of the conversation in the 90s was sort of what I'd mentioned about this, and it kind of gets to Michelle's question too about why it's fraught to exhibit Chinese art abroad. I mean, there was extreme sensitivity to power differentials, to transmutations of meaning and intent, as context shifted, and I think there was in fact even a lot of art made about that very topic. To say nothing of Lee Senting's famous essay about we don't want to be spring rolls at the banquet of international art. So there was a lot of what we look at now as kind of progressive identity politics kinds of stuff. I mean, in the Chinese context, obviously coming to the fore in that early period. And I think after 2000, it gets really complicated because the scene was united in the 90s kind of in its resistance and in its marginality. And then suddenly, really right around the time of, say, the Three Represents and the Hu Jintao ascendancy, the system starts to reform, and suddenly there's space inside the academies, inside CAFA and the academy in Hangzhou for experimental art. And a lot of it was whiplash. I mean, Chodjie, for example, who made the map, right, and that May started by talking about in 1999, he was curating underground exhibitions, extremely radical artists working with animal corpses and even body parts and things. By 2003, 2004, he was a professor at the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, and today he's a dean at CAFA. I mean, he's one of the 5 probably senior people at the Central Academy. So, how to understand that transition kind of into this state apparatus, and how to understand the different layers of kind of artistic discourse in this kind of larger state system is a really complicated topic, and one that, of course, in the last few years has become even more difficult. Yes, I think that's both of those questions.
Yeah. It actually touched on something I've been curious. Like among the 1 million visitors you get, do you know the nationality split? What percentage is domestic Chinese now? And is there a shift sort of among the artists before, early on, they were making art for the international stage? Are they shifting more, thinking of domestic audience?
Sure. So our audience is, I would say, more than 90%, local Chinese is kind of not even the right word, because there are a lot of people come from other places, are visiting Beijing from other cities or what have you. But yeah, I mean, I in the beginning, you might have had a pretty significant proportion of visitors to 798 or to UCCA being foreign tourists, but that changed a while ago. And so, our core demographic is, it skews a bit female, it skews educated, and it skews kind of, 18 to 34. So that's the kind of like the prototypical UCCA visitor. But we do a lot to engage families. We try to engage, all different kinds of communities. And then, in terms of the artists, I mean, what's actually really interesting is that basically, starting with this on-off generation, to come back to that again, you end up in this position where work stops being, identifiably Chinese a lot of the time, right? It's not necessarily playing on visual resources or elements coming from so-called traditional culture or from kind of modern political memory, but instead is, you have sort of formal abstract painting, or sort of process-based conceptual work, or things in film and video that are very much in a kind of real-time global conversation. And this gets accelerated even more. There's a generation of artists we talk about globally right now called the post-internet generation. So it's kind of like what marketers talk about as digital natives. So artists who kind of have come into art, as creatures of the internet, and it's kind of it's almost like Fluxes in the 60s or something. In that, it's a movement that you can look at centers in Berlin or in New York, but also you actually have a significant number of artists making art in this vein inside of China and in conversation with their peers around the world. So it's a more complicated, but in a way more organic kind of internationalization that you see now. And that's for an institution like us to be able to kind of spotlight these different generations in the same place, everyone from people who came of age in the 70s and 80s to the latest thing. I'm always so inspired by that diversity.
Last time when I visited your place, what I was really impressed was I ran into this lady who was a volunteer docent, right? I think she was in her 70s, and
yes.
But she came to like embrace modern art full on, and to be honest, this was the first time that I ran into a volunteer docent in a Chinese sort of museum gallery institution. How are you pioneering that kind of a program? It's very different for China.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so funny because yes, you have a a woman in her 70s as a docent at a museum, which if you go to New York, that's, I mean, to be honest, kind of like maybe the core demographic, right? I mean, it's generally or you go to the Fort Worth or somewhere, this would be unremarkable. But in China, she became a kind of internet celebrity because I think what it was really was that for a lot of young people who are engaging with kind of global culture, I think they felt themselves quite different from their parents or their grandparents. So then to see someone of this older generation who shared this interest and this passion, I think was really affirming and inspiring for them. Of course, yes, doing it for free is it always raises eyebrows in China too. But no, but she's become, so I think she has like her own program online now, and she's really become. There she is, Shanghai, kind of a key piece of our public persona. But it's really not just her. Actually, a few weeks ago, this young guy who works Monday through Friday he's a junior person at an investment company, and then the last 3 years he's spent every weekend giving tours at UCCA. He wrote this, I can send it to you, wrote this beautiful essay about what he learned from giving tours at UCCA for all these years, and what he learned about art, what he learned about other people. It's just this incredible text that's just also I think very life affirming. So he had a moment, kind of a lot of attention online, and then actually even more recently, we have a security guard who's actually quite a great docent in his own right. I mean, who has a lot of ideas about art and about the work on view, and so he's been. We featured actually it's always the state media. Beijing Rubao wrote this big piece about him, and then other media have come along to do some coverage as well. So yeah, it's not a marketing stunt. I think it's more like, but I think it's a way to make things relevant, so people you can talk all you want about this artist and why they're great and what they did and how important it is, but there's always going to be this skepticism or this idea that art is a little bit distant or that it's removed from our lives. But you get these so-called the other kinds of people who aren't professional curators or something really talking about what they find interesting and what impassions them, and it draws people in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a very good question here. It's a lot of people probably think of this question but don't ask. So how do you judge the good artwork at first sight? Or you don't judge on first sight?
How do you? Well, I mean, I think it's like any, you're sort of building up a system of knowledge and of references and of experience, and it allows you to interact with new things that you see in a more grounded way, I suppose, and to always be looking to have that framework challenged, right? And so I think it's pretty natural to want to incorporate things one sees into a body of experience and reference. But yeah, also too, but I think we should also not discount the immediate power of the work too. I mean, I think a great artwork can play to a specialist audience, but also to a very general audience at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a question that's a little bit long. I might take a second to read.
Yeah, I'm looking at okay,
read it out for everyone.
Kissinger trying
to missionary the whole of the United States has obligation to spread values to China. It's a little harder to get this question, say the relationship between culture and imperialism. I think we discussed, I think you touched on this identity.
Yeah, I mean, no, so just again, like Christopher is featured in the current exhibition at UCCA. So if you happen to, if you're in Beijing, please come see his piece there. He's also an incredible mentor to so many young artists and art workers and students in New York, where he's lived for a long time. This is like, we could have a whole seminar about this question. And basically, does art work in relation to power in China in a way that's different from how it does in the West. And I think, I guess, I think one distinction we need to draw is between like China through the ages and the PRC, or even the PRC since 2012, because these things are changing, and because this question of like where one fits in relation to the state is just so present all the time. And I think I'm always interested to see, everyone in the West knows Ai Weiwei and this kind of very oppositional, confrontational politics, but it's not binary, right? And there are different kinds of accommodation and different kinds of, every day is a kind of compromise and is a decision about, and for us as an institution, but I think for artists on an individual level as well, about, what kind of space one can claim, what kind of impact one might be able to have, even despite or sometimes because of the strictures and the context and expectations and all these other kind of external forces. So I guess to get to the point of Christopher's question, I'm always, I'm definitely interested in thinking about, if we look at kind of American art museums or Western art museums, right, they're sort of temples of citizenship in a way, right? There's this idea that, and this is the flip side, or the kind of the nicer looking side of imperialism. But the intent is often to educate the people so that they can make more informed decisions and lead more inspired democratic lives. But when you take contemporary art and put it in China, you kind of have to, maybe in the 90s, there was the idea, like on that Fan Li Jun Time magazine cover, right, that the artists were going to bring the system down. But we sort of know that's not going to happen. So then the question becomes, well, what can they still do? And what can we still do in light of that? And I think that, I don't think you ever come up with a final answer or resolution, but I also think that it's, we have to believe that art can do things that are not so directly teleological, right? That it can open up spaces that are open, and that, in which we can dwell and in which people can have new kinds of ideas and encounters and can maybe envision new kinds of solidarity, and can essentially just be together and be in the historical moment in a way they might not otherwise. So it's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but that's sort of how I keep going, for sure.
With curating many more shows to keep the dialogue going, I would say. That's incredible. One last question. I actually am going to touch on something very light. You mentioned Shanghai's art scene has boomed beyond the M50 galleries. Tell us where to go.
Oh, I just saw, in your opening slide, you it seemed to mention a number of places, and they all look great. The interesting thing with Shanghai is you have this kind of virtuous circle where actually the different districts of Shanghai are kind of in competition with one another, and they funnel kind of money to these art institutions in different ways. So a lot of action has been in Xuhui around the West Bund. So you have places like the Law Museum, the Hughes Museum, more recently the Tank. Every year in the fall, you have the West Bund Art Fair, and then a lot of the galleries have moved to the West Bund too. So like Shang Art. And if you go to M50, the place to go is still it's called Antenna Space. This is a really great young guy who has a gallery that's very much in this kind of international conversation we've been talking about. But there's also, what we shouldn't forget, in Shanghai you have the Rock Bund, which is closed for renovations right now, but is in just a completely beautiful Art Deco building renovated by David Chipperfield, and has done a great program since 2010. But you also have the Power Station of Art, which is, in 2000, around the time, just after the Expo, they took the Shanghai Art Museum that I showed you the image of Huang Yongping's sandcastle in 2000, and they divided it, right? So the contemporary part went to the power station, which is also not far from the West Bund, and this giant old power station. And this is where the Shanghai Biennale happens. And it's really the only kind of state-funded contemporary art institution of any public massive scale in China. So that's a good place to go as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about, the funding side, the fun side of running the business. But, we've run out of time, and we'll try to work. Thank you so much, Philip. This is amazing. And let's keep the dialogue open. Hopefully we can bring your UCCA show in Beijing live to our community from the world. And if you want to find out when the next events will be, the top left-hand corner of the slide has our WeChat account. You can just scan and you will see more events coming up. And just a quick word, coming up next on, I think, 23rd in US and 24th in China is our book club event. We're reading Lisa C's book, The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane. So by then we'll be visiting Yunnan. And we have to go back to China. Hopefully the flights will be more frequent and the virus pandemic, someday we'll be back home. Thank you, Philip. Thanks, everybody.
You.